It's a pleasure to be back here. You know, for us, the Global Empowerment Meeting is always a very, very enjoyable occasion. We prepare a lot for it. We think things through, and it's always exciting to see how it all unfolds and how it all happens. So I would like to express all of you my deepest thanks for having honored us with your presence, and I hope to challenge and learn from you in the next couple of days. And I'd like to thank Helen for her nice introductory remarks and for taking on this MC job. I think that, you know, some practice and preparation over a few years at BBC might have prepared you for this challenging task. This year, we're introducing like a new theme. And whenever you introduce a new theme, it's something that, like, we think it has long legs. We don't know, never know if ideas have long legs or not. But this is a new topic for us, and we're trying to get our minds around it. So this is a very tentative introduction of a new topic. And this topic arose in part because, yeah, it would be better if this worked. How about if you give me one that works? Okay. There we go. A lot has happened since we last met. You know, all the news that have happened, I'm going to highlight a few of them that, you know, everybody has paid enormous attention to. For example, England was knocked off the Euro Cup in June 2016 by none other than Iceland. So I'm sure that caught your attention, right? Now, the Euro Cup is a tough competition. I don't know exactly how many European teams are in total, but 24 of them classified for the Euro Cup in last summer. And, you know, there were countries like, you know, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, and each one of these countries had their own football team. Right? Now, this is somewhat odd, because if you look back at the 13th century, there was nothing called Italy, there was nothing called Germany, right? It was this incredible hodgepodge of different sovereign states, counting some 350 or so, that existed back then, while, you know, Great Britain was much more homogeneous. There were very few other people, so it was not as big a hodgepodge kind of thing. But in spite of this history, you know, the French believe that, you know, they're adequately represented by a French team, the Germans by a German team, the Italians by an Italian team, even though if you look here, there were, you know, I don't know how many countries, like a dozen countries in what is today Italy. But obviously, the Brits were represented by 3 teams: England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, right? And the reason why they were represented by 3 teams, it's because Scotland and Gibraltar didn't make it. Now, the fact that Britain, being the oldest state of its kind in the region, couldn't field a single team, but Scots and maybe Northern Ireland, you know, they might have won, but it would not have been our team. Would not have been our team. So we would rather have a team that's really our team than a broader team that might win, but it's not really us. So it's not that much of a surprise that in the same month, Britain also voted to say, why do we want to belong to the European team, right? And maybe Brexit, it was sort of like the consequence of that. So what I'm trying to introduce here is the idea that underpinning many things in social life is the sense of belonging to some abstract sense of us. You know, we call this world the New World. Venezuela became independent in 1821. Germany became the current state in 1871, 50 years later. So the idea that of self-identifying yourself as German and so on, or as Venezuelan, or as British, or whatever. It's something that happens in an odd way, and I'm trying to elaborate a little bit on it. Now, other things happened that also caught your attention. One of them is that there's a new president in the US, and he promised to build a Great Wall. And the Great Wall is there to protect us from them, right? So it's very important to protect us from them. And the wall might do it for the Mexicans, but for the Muslims, we'd rather not have them fly in, right? And that's one reaction to how you process the fact that there is an us and a them out there. Very different from the way the Canadians processed it. Because tragically, in September 2nd or 3rd, 2015, this little kid died in a beach of Bodrum in Turkey. And it just so happened that he had an aunt living in Vancouver. And the aunt had tried to get him and his family to Canada. But Stephen Harper had changed the refugee rules in Canada, and bringing them pretty much to a halt right at the time when the Syrian crisis was getting worse. When this news broke, and the connection to decisions made in February and March of that year by Stephen Harper came out, there was a generalized perception that that behavior did not represent Canadian values, that that was not what we do. That is not us. And as a consequence, Harper, that was pretty sure to win the election, lost to this guy who was supposed to come in third. So in the end, this political event also signals something about us. What does it mean to be us? So that's what was happening at the world. What has been happening at CID? Well, in CID, we remain focused on trying to understand the secret of the wealth of nations. We think that the reason why some countries are rich and other countries are poor is essentially explained by how much technology has diffused into those countries. And technology, we think, is composed of three fundamental ingredients: tools and codes, protocols, how to do manuals, recipes. Now, if technology was tools and codes, it would be very easy to create an NGO that would solve the development problem, because the NGO would just put the tools on a container and put the codes on the web. But it just so happens that technology requires not only tools and codes, but also know-how. Know-how is something that resides only in brains, and it's needed to deploy the tools and implement the codes. The problem is that technology, the know-how is very hard to get into brains. It moves very slowly. Malcolm Gladwell says that it takes 10,000 hours to become good at something. And so technology is very difficult to move because know-how is very difficult to move, and know-how, and without the know-how, tools and codes are not terribly effective. We can measure how much know-how is in a product by asking how many people with different skills need to be engaged in making a particular product. This is a subsistence farming family in Ecuador, and we know that they know how to make these products because they do. Over the course of, say, the 19th century, more specialization occurred in production. So you have, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, and in those days, a butcher would be a butcher, and that would be in the butchery industry. A baker would be in the bakery industry, and a candlestick maker in the candlestick industry. But today, production is not done that way. Today, production is done with many, many different occupations in a single industry. For example, you all flew in. In order for you to fly in, somebody had to make the airplane. I won't go into the complexities of making the airplane, but somebody has to staff the flight attendants, the pilots, the air traffic controllers, the handlers of luggage, the security people, so that in order to implement that technology, you have to bring together a group of people. And we call this the Scrabble theory of development, where different places have different collections of letters, and depending on the letters you have, depending on this variety of know-how that you have, you can make more words, like in the game of Scrabble, and you can make longer words. That's our general take on the secret of development. Now, the problem is that in order to diffuse technology, you need to diffuse the know-how. And one way that know-how diffuses is through migration. Because it is hard to move know-how into brains. It's much easier to move brains. So know-how depends a lot on human mobility, whether it's between firms, between regions of the same country, or between countries. And you will hear tomorrow morning when Frank Nefke will speak about our research that documents that fact. So the problem is that when you look at developing countries from the prism of migration, you see this enormous dispersion. Everybody wants to be like Singapore. Singapore has 40% of its population is foreign-born. Hong Kong has 40% of its population is foreign-born. Israel has almost 40% of its population that is foreign-born. Australia and Canada have about 25% of their population is foreign-born. The US, Spain, and so on has about 15% of the population that is foreign-born. So when you look at the rest of the developing world, you find that there's one foreigner for every 2.4 people in Singapore, one foreigner for every 24 people in Panama, a country of, we did a study this year that Miguel Santos will summarize tomorrow morning. Mexico, there's one foreigner out of every 240 people. I mean, and there's one foreigner for every 400 persons in Colombia. You have to imagine how smart Colombians are to be able to run the country with only Colombians, given that Harvard doesn't know how to run with only US-born talent. So you might ask yourself, why do you have this enormous closure vis-a-vis migration? So whenever you try to understand a phenomenon, why do countries adopt certain policies? That is a question in what we call political economy. And the way political economy has been developed up to now is basically to ask the question from the point of view of Homo economicus. And Homo economicus is essentially a worldview that says that we are all autonomous individuals, so we are all our own particular individuality, that we have preferences, of which there isn't much to say, because of tastes there's nothing to dispute, and we face constraints. And as a consequence, by the way, we have brains to figure out what we like best, given our preferences and the constraints that we face, and we use our brains to work it out. So there are two reasons why people make different choices. One is that they have different preferences, and the other one is that they face different constraints. Countries make different choices for three reasons. One is because their population might have a different distribution of preferences. Second, because their population has a different distribution of constraints. And third, that they aggregate those preferences in different ways. Some may have first-past-the-post electoral systems, others may have proportional representation systems, some may do more gerrymandering than others, some may count the votes, others may count electoral colleges, and so on. But they aggregate those preferences in some way. In my own country, they don't aggregate them too much. They just decide. This paradigm defines the scope of the thinkable. And it was because we were sort of like trapped in this paradigm that we sort of like could not get our hands around of what are these phenomena that we were observing. By the way, the Homo economicus is being attacked from many sides, and behavioral economics is one field where economists, in a supreme act of uncharacteristic humility, gave the Nobel Prize to a psychologist, David Kahneman, for his contributions to sort of like transform the axioms of Homo economicus into hypotheses that could be tested in a lab and so on. But I'm going to take a different stab, a different kind of critique, more based on more recent developments in psychology. Now, let's start with things we can all agree. We can all agree that we have brains, right? And is this a controversial? So the starting point is that the idea that we have brains is the biggest misconception there is. Okay? We don't have brains. Our brains have us. We are, in some sense, an illusion created by our brains. Our brains are much bigger than this sense of the brains we have. And that's a bit of an idea that was developed in this recent book by Bruce Hood, The Self-Illusion. Okay? So our brain creates a mind that is aware of its surroundings, and this mind is able to turn on itself and to think about not what's around it, but about itself. So it's kind of like a mirror into yourself, right? So the self is the capacity to reflect on your own perceptions of things. So it's you thinking about what you're thinking, about the things that you're thinking, about thinking, and so on. So Kierkegaard said it in a different way. He said, the self is a relationship between the self and its own self. Douglas Hofstadter has a book called I Am a Strange Loop. Okay, so it's this circular reflection on itself. And Antonio Damasio wrote this very interesting book called Self Comes to Mind. That is that the mind creates a self, and the self is actually, it's an interesting thing. It's an autobiographical self. I have the impression that I was here like a minute ago. You too think I was here a minute ago, I hope, and an hour ago, and a day ago, and a year ago, and a decade ago. And I can sort of like tell a story, a narrative, some kind of autobiography of what it means to be me. Now, in time, I'm constantly changing what I think I am, but I think that I've been that thing forever. But, people go through midlife crises and reinvent themselves and so on, restructure. They retell a completely different story about who they are. So that's the self. And the self knows that they are not alone in this universe. And in particular, there are two kinds of things out there in the universe. And one of the things that are out there in the universe are things. And things move according to the laws of physics. And the brain is very good at figuring out how things move. And in that, we are not a unique animal. We can catch balls, and dogs can catch balls and frisbees and so on. So the brain knows how things move and can guess how things are going to move. But not all the things in the world are things. The other things that are out there are beings. And beings move not because of the laws of physics, but because of intention. Okay? Now, it is something that was really important for us to read in people's mind. So we have a significant part of our brain dedicated to figuring out what other people are thinking, what other people are feeling, what other people are planning, the intentions of other people. We look not just at what they say, but the intonation, the body language, etc. That's a significant other chunk of the brain. Now, we are a super cooperative species. And if you came last year, you saw Joseph Henrich present his book on cooperation being the secret of human success, and that no other species on Earth is able to accumulate so much know-how, so much knowledge, so much culture than humans, because humans are sort of like designed for cooperation, and we can cooperate in very, very large groups. But in order to cooperate with others, we have to develop a sense of cooperation. We have to develop a sense of us. Now, what sustains our ability to cooperate? Because cooperation is hard because of what we call the Freerider Problem. We can all agree that, if we all behave in a certain way, like, for example, paying our taxes, it will be for the better, because if there are no taxes paid, we wouldn't have a bunch of things that we need to have. But we would be much better off if everybody else pays their taxes and we shirk on our responsibilities, right? So how do we contain that problem? And what some of the speakers that you'll hear in this evening have been working on is the idea that we evolved to become cooperative. We sort of like were genetically modified. We evolved to become cooperative by a trick. The same trick that evolution used to make sure that we spread our genes. It didn't sort of like prepare an online course on how to reproduce your genes, right? It developed the sex instinct. And to sustain cooperation, we developed a moral instinct. When you are responsible for something like paying your taxes and you don't, you feel guilty. When other people find out, you feel ashamed. When you find out that other people cheated, you feel outrage. And you start gossiping on other people, and it's been documented that gossip provides pleasure. And then, when you are the butt of gossip, it provides pain. Okay? So, what sustains cooperation is a cocktail of neurotransmitters that were evolved to make us a cooperative species. And so I'll mention these three books. Robert Wright will be our dinner speaker. Jonathan Haidt has this beautiful book on moral psychology. And Joshua Green will be in the next panel. Now, while Homo economicus believes we are all sort of like super individual, completely a world unto ourselves, and then we just interact to figure out what each one of us wants to do, Matthew Lieberman has documented that the brain is really social to the core. That at the core of brain functions, it's complete awareness of what other people are doing, thinking about you, and so on. I like particularly this line that he has. Well, first of all, cooperation involves different senses of us, so I can think of us, the Hausmann family, or us, the Growth Lab family, or us, the CID family, or us, the Kennedy School family, or us, Harvard University, or us here in Boston, or us here in Massachusetts, or us here in the US. So there's different senses of us at different scales that supports this cooperation. And we think of this us as if it was a person. In fact, legal tradition has given legal personhood to corporations, right? So that they have a history, they have an autobiography, they have responsibilities, they have rights, they have reputations, they have temperament, right? So these different senses of us translate into the individual in the sense that your sense of self is not who you think you are, it's not who other people think you are, it's who you think other people think you are. So your sense of self is in itself deeply social. If I ask somebody, tell me, what is your identity? They'll say, well, I'm Latin American, I'm an economist, I'm Jewish, I am. So suddenly you define your own self not as your own intrinsic particular self, but as a set of belongings to other us's out there. So the self is deeply us. It's sort of like a reflection of us in our heads. Now, throughout history, we cooperated, but at very different scales. So when we moved from hunter-gathering to the Neolithic Revolution, we started to have slightly larger scales, but not very large. And we see that history of very small ranges of interaction in the fact of the Tower of Babel. Language has a natural tendency to drift and to change. And you realize that when you hear young people speak. You can no longer understand what they say and what they mean, right? So they use different words, different intonations, and so on. And through that channel, languages tend to change. So we know that, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and so on once were Latin, right? And we can understand how they evolved. But if you are in a very narrow range of cooperation, you don't really have to talk like the other people if you're not talking to them. You're not constrained by them understanding you because you don't talk to them. You don't interact with them. So a narrow radius of interaction is going to cause a big divergence of languages. So let me give you some numbers. In Alaska, there are 19 different native languages. In Mexico, there's over 130. In Cameroon, which is a country smaller than Spain, half the population of Spain, there are 230 languages. In Indonesia, there are over 700 languages. In India, there are over 1,600 languages. So Robert Wright, who will be speaking at dinner, has sort of like retold the story of humankind as a story of broadening scopes of cooperation. And so these broadening scopes of cooperation are going to be hitting in this heterogeneity at the level of the local people. Now, our societies have become increasingly more complex relative to those basic societies, so we have to interact with many, many more people. And among other things, we developed different kinds of organizations. I mentioned CID, the Kennedy School, Harvard University, et cetera, but we developed a state. And the question is, what is the state supposed to do? It's supposed to do things on behalf of us. What did you mean by us? Who is us? What is the sense of us that underpins the state? The state acts legitimately when it acts on behalf of us. And we perceive that it acts illegitimately when it doesn't act on behalf of us. What is this us? Who is this us? So Benedict Anderson, who passed away about 2 years ago, unfortunately, had this incredibly good term of us is an imagined community. It's a mental representation we make of what it means to be us. Okay? And as I said before in the same slide, there were very, very different senses of us in all of these places. These different senses of us were there because the state was very relatively small and had very few economies of scale. In particular, if you put a castle somewhere, it was very hard to attack because there was not too many arms that were good enough to destroy these castles, so you would have to siege them for a very long time. And because of that, this generated an enormous dispersion of political power. But then, in the early modern age, they invented the cannon. And with the cannon, you had a lot of concentration of power because the economies of scale in state production increased. And so you had the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that already had a significant, not complete, consolidation of power. And then came the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution required two things. It required first larger markets so that all these different products that were being introduced could be sold into a larger, deeper markets. So you wanted larger political entities that you could sell your stuff to. But it also required a larger set of public goods. The state had to do more than just protect you from outside invasion, it would have to provide education, it would have to assure health, it would have to insure people against disease, old age, unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have a much more intrusive state that now has to decide on a bunch of things in your life. Like, there's nothing more personal than the state deciding what are your children going to learn in school. So that is going to require, on the one hand, a broader sense of us so that we can have a larger market, say we Europeans, and on the other hand, a deeper sense of us in the sense that we share enough stuff so that our kids are going to learn the same curriculum, or that we will decide on that it's okay to tax us to subsidize somebody that we consider deserving. So we need to agree on all of that. And that's going to create an enormous tension between broadening the sense of us and deepening the sense of us. So Germany and Italy got reunited in essentially around 1870. And to reunite them, they had to create, for example, something like a language. Because in those days, there was nothing that you would call Italian. And they decided to create an Italian language basing itself on the language in Florence. And there was no such thing as a German language either, so there were many vernaculars. So they decided to create Hochdeutsch, or Standard German. And now these people, even though they can fluently talk to each other through interpreters, they've decided that they want to create a bigger union, right? That there's something about a broader sense of us that they find compelling. Not super compelling, as I'm told for the next Sunday's election in France, but compelling. So the point is that cooperation is grounded first and foremost in moral sentiments and feelings that we have. That's the underlying glue of this all. And these feelings are also strengthened by some founding myths. If you look, for example, at the Old Testament, some scholars, biblical scholars, say that the oldest part of the Old Testament is the book of Judges and the book of Samuel 1 and 2. And in that part, what it says, essentially, is that Philistines were putting military pressure on these 12 tribes. And they decided to form a unified kingdom under first King Saul and then King David. And then these scholars say, after that, the book of Genesis was written long after. And the book of Genesis said that these 12 tribes were really all sons of Jacob. So in fact, these guys were all brothers. So it's a fantastic founding myth if you want to bring together, under a single kingdom, 12 different tribes. And in some sense, that is the challenge that many countries face. What does it mean to be Nigerian? What does it mean to be South African? What does it mean to be Cameroonian or Kenyan, right? So another one that I like very much is the founding myth of the US, which says, essentially, that the US was this godforsaken place until we had these founding fathers that bequeathed to us this fantastic constitution that gave us the freedoms, that gave us the rights, it gave us democracy, it gave us prosperity. I mean, if it wasn't for these founding fathers, we today would look like Canada. Because Canada is sort of like the natural experiment of the provinces that decided to remain loyal to King George. So, but it's a fantastic founding myth, because then everybody respects the Constitution, loves the Constitution, protects the Constitution, reacts about the Constitution, and so on. Nation states in Europe were all based on the idea, the ones that were created in the 19th century, on language. And people say, well, what's this technicality on language? But language implies a common history, implies a network of people you can talk to that have read the same newspapers you've read, that listen to the same sort of like cultural books and art production and so on. So this was the complicated path towards state formations and the sense of us in the industrialized world. If you look at the developing world, what happened was that with the Industrial Revolution, there was this enormous possibility of deploying technologies and business and goods and so on across the world, but these these business opportunities required these places to have something that you might want to call state functions. For example, the East India Company, the British East India Company, wanted to sell stuff in India and buy stuff in India. So they put some warehouses over there. These warehouses were attacked. They wanted to sell stuff, write contracts. There was no way of doing any of that. So they started to sort of like self-provide these functions. So the world did not have sort of like the state institutions that would have supported the expansion of the market economy. And as a consequence, they sort of like stumbled into empire. And interestingly, for about over 100 years, as you know, in India, India was really managed by the East India Company until in 1857. 1857! You know, the British Crown decided, no, this is too serious a business to be done by a private company. No, we have to do it more seriously. So, and you know, the scramble for Africa, which started in 1890, was essentially driven by the idea that, you know, there might be opportunities there, but there's, you know, all these small tribes speaking these very different languages, no overarching state, no way to move things around, no way to sign contracts. We need to provide state functions. And so the states of the developing world have radically different senses, underpinnings in terms of very heterogeneous senses of us. You know, we have some ancient states in the developing world, countries that were never colonized, like China, Ethiopia, Thailand, and Afghanistan, or never really colonized for much long. Latin America, interestingly enough, after 300 years of Spanish colonialism with significant population movements towards the region, ended up creating 18 states that have more or less the same language and more or less the same dominant religion. So the question in Latin America is not like in Nigeria, what does it make us us? But, you know, what makes a Venezuelan different from a Colombian? Well, obviously, we make the arepas much better, but that's a different story. In the Arab states, you had, you know, the creation of 19 different Arab-speaking states that more or less have the same dominant religion, that more or less have the same. So again, what makes an Algerian different from a Tunisian or a Moroccan or an Egyptian and so on? So what gives our sense of us? India is one of the miracles of the world because this is a country that decided not to reduce complexity in any dimension. That, you know, you have hundreds of languages, 14 different scripts, all religions and so on, and they thought that they could make it work, and it has worked amazingly. Pakistan, by contrast, decided to reduce complexity in one dimension. They said, no, Pakistan is Muslim. And the exchange was about Pakistan being Muslim. So Islam was a very important part of the sense of us in the creation of that state. In sub-Saharan Africa, we have today 53 states that host over 2,000 languages in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can imagine then the complexities of creating a sense of us that underpins that variety. And when you cannot create a sense of us, you have people voting their identity, you have tribal politics and so on. And as this book from Michelle Wrong from Kenya says, it's our turn to eat. That is, when your tribe takes over the state, it's for your people, right? And for your people means us, the tribe, not us, some kind of broader imagined community. So different uses are going to reflect in different policy choices. This is a graph I took from Peter Hall. Peter Hall will be here tomorrow in the final panel. And this shows the relationship between disposable income inequality, that is how unequal are these places, and support for redistribution to the poor. And you might say that more unequal places would be more willing to redistribute to the poor, but in essence, you see a relatively weak relationship. The willingness of people to redistribute to the poor is extremely heterogeneous. It's not terribly related to how unequal it is. If anything, it's like the other way around. The relation is slightly negative in the sense that the more unequal places are places where you don't want to redistribute to the poor. And one simple hypothesis is that the poor are not really us. They are different from us. That when the poor are really like us, we feel more that it's kind of we are supporting us, right? But if they're less like us, maybe they deserve what they got. Maybe they, in any case, I'm busy enough protecting us, I don't have to protect them. So this brings to a different light the problem of low state capacity. As you know, this book by our colleagues Daron Acemoglu and Jim Robinson says nations fail because they adopt lousy institutions. Had they just adopted better institutions, the things would have turned out differently. But the question is, what is the state? What's the underpinnings of the state? Who is the us behind the state? How did you construct the state? What were the challenges that the state had to deal with that were completely different in some settings than in others? So the idea that it's sort of like, you had like blue and red at some point in history and you chose blue rather than red, not really. I mean, you were facing extremely different challenging issues in the process of state formation. So back to our original question, why is the developing world so close to foreigners? We've documented, and we'll show more tomorrow, that foreigners can really bring a lot to the table. They add more letters, different letters that we can combine with our own letters to make more words, longer words. They can represent a big improvement on things. Here's a map of the countries of the world that have no path to citizenship or no path to permanent residence. There's a bunch of these countries that just don't have a path. There's no way, you can go there, you can be born there, you can whatever, you have no path to residence. It includes our friends from Sri Lanka. It includes Liberia, a country that was created by returning American slaves. And in the Liberian constitution, it says you cannot be Liberian unless you are black African. And you can understand why that is there if you understand their history. He said, look, we were taken involuntarily out of our country to the US. Now we're back. We don't want us to be again dominated by the whites that we had to become free of. And there is not only that there's no path to citizenship or permanent residence in many places, there are enormous constraints on hiring foreigners. So for example, in Ireland, they have a limit to a maximum of 50% non-EU citizens in a firm. You cannot have more than half the people not be EU citizens. They don't require them to be Irish, just EU citizens. In Kazakhstan, also represented here in the room, there is a rule that says cannot be more than 30% foreigners. In Egypt, Guatemala, and Panama, there's a maximum of 10% foreigners per firm. In Cambodia, they do better. It's 6% foreigners. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's 4% foreigners. And then, in Ghana, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Thailand, depending on the size of the firm, they allow either one foreigner or two foreigners. Now, you can start to understand why these things might be there. Okay? They come, according to our research, at a humongous cost in terms of development. Okay? They come at a humongous cost. But the reason why they are there is because, in some sense, foreigners are not us, and this is about us and not them. And we have a relatively narrow sense of us that prevents us from exploiting the opportunities that diversity would generate. So, summing up, development requires technological diffusion. For that to happen, you need a capable state and the mixing of know-how from abroad. A capable state requires an imagined community that is deep enough to agree on providing complex goods. What's our education? How much redistribution will we do? How much would we tax ourselves to do all that? And broad enough to allow enough mixing of know-how. Many states, rich and poor, are stumbling on a shared sense of us. In some sense, you could say that the last election in the US was about a broader sense of us that included blacks and and Latinos and Muslims and so on, and a narrower sense of us that in some sense we're a deeper sense of us that, hey, give me a break. This is the US that we know that we belong to, right? So it's the problem that the Brexiteers expressed in Britain. It's the problem that's being discussed in France. So the world is sort of like stumbling against these tensions on the sense of us that have to do with the need for a broader sense of us and a need for a deeper sense of us. So the question is, what will the future sense of us be? And thank you very much.